resume?
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Although the Marine is a very large place, I have to leave it now and return to a few other things. Could I have First Nations Coalition tab 37, which is Document for Identification BBB. Ms. Dansfer, early in the hearings, this document was put to Dr. Paradis from Environment Canada. It's a memo to you from Mitch Bloom regarding the administration and enforcement of the pollution prevention provisions of Section 36 of the Fisheries Act. It was signed by you on December 29th, 2010. Do you recognize this document?
I prefer to see the, excuse me, I prefer to see the page with my signature because this looks like the cover of any
Absolutely.
any memo.
There you go. There it is.
Yes, definitely.
Could I have that
ready?
Thank you. Could I have that marked as the next exhibit?
Can I just clarify that this document says it's actually BB, not triple B?
Oh, sorry. I might have one extra B in my notes.
Thank you.
So you want that to become a full
I want that as a
now.
full exhibit now.
With that caveat, VB will be rescinded. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like to take
1960. 1960.
1960, and I'd like to take you to page 3 of that document, the second bullet from the bottom. And while he's doing that, Ms. Dansfer, it says that the main disadvantage of DFO not controlling Section 36 issues is related to aquaculture and aquatic invasive species. It goes on to say that Environment Canada may pursue those issues on a different priority or take a different approach, potentially resulting in delays. Could you explain why you think Environment Canada's approach would differ and why that would be significant for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans?
If I may, this is one document amongst many where we are, or whether or not they're documents, certainly one document within a long series of discussions that we've been having on the pros and cons of various approaches. So this was a statement. Well, I don't have any proof to back up this statement. It's simply a conjecture on the part of Mitch or the group when they were writing this. But it clearly what it means is that more work is required and more discussions would be required with Environment Canada.
Do you know when they were talking about the delays, were they talking about delays in issuing new licenses for aquaculture? Is that what the concern was?
It could be in general delays. It could have been aquaculture, but anything else as well.
You don't recall?
No.
Maybe I'll try this one to see whether or not you have any recollection. On page 4, bullet 2, it says that you agree to the pursuit of Environment Canada becoming fully accountable for Section 36 of the Fisheries Act, including that new aquaculture pest control regulations, future aquaculture waste, and other emerging issues. And here's the question I have, as it would best serve to limit DFO's immediate and future liabilities. Could you tell me what liabilities you were concerned with here and how this would serve to limit yours?
I think it's one of the areas where there was some consideration given to, and this is a very narrow area, to the potential that we may be perceived to have some conflict between being the regulator and working with the industry. And so it's very difficult in some of these circumstances for the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans on certain files. So it would be better left to potentially another minister doing this. But as I say, the discussions have not yet finalized, and I haven't had them with the minister yet.
All right. Thank you for that in terms of helping us understand what the words meant and what your intentions were there. I'll need to move on again. Ms. Dansfer and Mr. Bevan, the next area of questions that I'm going to have, and I'll just preface it this way, is that there has been an experience by First Nations and others in the province that sometimes the chain of communication could be improved between those of us working on the ground and the decision makers in Ottawa. And in particular, from a First Nations perspective, the need to develop better processes for ensuring that as decision makers in Ottawa, you're best informed of the nature of the impacts or infringements that could result from your decisions and how those might be mitigated. So what I'm going to do now is take you to 3 examples, and then thankfully, again, as I mentioned in my preface, I've got a proposed approach to how we might address this. So we're going to start with the aquaculture decisions, then we're going to go on to Sarah, and then the approval of the IFMPs. Now, as it relates to aquaculture, Well, Stansfer, I heard your evidence earlier that you were the ones that was the decision maker to roll over approximately 130 existing finfish farm licenses in December 2010. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you recall when in the process DFO determined that it would roll over these licenses? And in particular, was it part of the understanding reached with the province when the process for transfer of regulatory responsibilities was being implemented?
It was part of an ongoing process.
So was it part of the discussions that you had with the province? Is that when it was determined that you would roll over those licenses?
I can't answer that, I don't know. And I'm aware also that there is an ongoing court case on the question of consultation around these licenses, so I'm
I know,
afraid
but-
I'm going to have to be a little bit careful here.
Well, you'll need to answer my questions, though, whether or not there's an outstanding court case or not.
Well,
with due respect, if I...
there's a number of things that come into play, and Ms. Gertner's client is one of the litigants in the court case that's referred to, and this is not an examination for discovery in that court case.
No.
So I think there has to be some care taken.
I am actually trying to be as careful as I can, Mr. Commissioner, and as you recall, you've had evidence and concerns raised about the decision, and so I'm just trying to understand the timing and the process. I'm not, he's not going to make a finding of fact in this inquiry that's going to affect the outstanding court case. Was it, as I understand it, was part of the process. You said you made the decision. I'm just curious, when in the process was that decision made?
I would have to go back and look at the notes. It was a period we were, as you are aware, I think we had very limited time to make a whole series of decisions. We were meeting on a regular basis, and I'm not sure exactly at what point in that process that decision was made, whether it was early or later. I'm not sure if David remembers.
I can't recall the specific moment when that was taken. I know we had a number of discussions about the need to rapidly take over the responsibilities from the province. There were discussions with the province, but that decision, as I recall, was one that was put to us by those involved in the development of the program. And it happened in a discussion in Ottawa, but and without the province being directly engaged in that. It was just a suite of options. How do we get to the finish line by December 18th and be ready to continue on with the industry on the one hand, but also take on our responsibilities on the other. So I can't give you a date. I think it was in the obviously second half of the year, but I can't tell you much more specifically than that.
All right, while Mr. Lunn is bringing forward Exhibit 1589, which is tab 44 of our documents, Mr. Andy Thompson, who I'm sure you're familiar with in relation to this, has come and given evidence. And on September 1st, in an answer to a question of mine, and I'll just read it. So you took no additional or independent steps at the time in which you made the decision in December 2010. You just assumed, since this criteria was in place, that the existing finfish farms had been screened for that purpose. Mr. Thompson replied, I assumed that the sighting buffer had been in place since 2000 and provided some measure of comfort that these sighting buffers had been adhered to before making that decision. Yes. So, to your knowledge, Ms. Dansero, did DFO take any steps in 2010 to determine whether the sighting criteria remain current with existing scientific understandings regarding the relationship between finfish farms and wild stocks, including cumulative impacts associated with climate change, before you made the decision to roll over the licenses in 2010? Oh, you'll have to go forward. I was giving you page 5. Sorry, Mr. Lund. That gives you the citing criteria, if that's useful to you to have in front of you. But the question is, to your knowledge, Ms. Dansero, did DFO take any steps in 2010 to determine whether the sighting criteria remain current with current scientific understandings regarding the relationship between finfish and wild stocks, in this case Fraser River sockeye, including cumulative impacts associated with climate change, before making the decision to roll over these licenses in 2010?
The advice that I received was such that the sites as they currently were in compliance with the rules that existed, and that we would be working with them over time to ensure that any future requirements would be met.
Did you take any steps to ensure or inform yourself that the criteria was actually being met by the existing farms?
There was no evidence otherwise.
So you didn't take any specific steps to determine whether or not the criteria, as general as it can be, i.e. that would preempt important Aboriginal commercial or recreational fisheries, that criteria was current in 2010.
I can't remember if it was in the advice that I received.
You don't recall it.
That's right.
Now, the second question on aquaculture is more of a process question, Ms. Dansero. I had an opportunity to talk to Mr. Backman, who was a representative from industry as it relates to finfish farms, and discussed with him the challenges we have in British Columbia around creating certainty for industry in a situation where outstanding issues around First Nations impacts and rights are in place. And we had an opportunity to talk about the benefits of a protocol that could be put into place that would help facilitate the necessary consultation that could occur. And that protocol would be between the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and First Nations, and be clearly set out industry's role in helping to answer some outstanding questions. Do you also see that such a protocol like that would be valuable to you going forward?
I'm always supportive of as many parties as possible developing protocols and developing rules of engagement so that we are all more comfortable in what the future may hold.
And so in particular, a protocol that set out the roles and responsibilities and how industry could participate and fund the necessary studies that would need to be completed to assess the potential impacts and options for mitigation associated with these farms and the exercise of Section 35 fishing rights would be useful to you?
I think a protocol between the First Nations and industry to set out what you described would be quite useful.
I think we need to go one step further, though, because as a decision maker, you're going to make decisions about renewals of these licenses. Would it be useful to have this protocol in place so these studies could be completed, so you could assess the potential impacts to the exercise of these rights going forward and make adjustments to the licenses in a necessary way?
It's hard to say in the specific. In the general, I would agree, yes, but whether or not we have sufficient information at this time in preparation for the next round, I'm not sure. But as a general practice, it might be a good idea.
And so as a result of hearing all of the evidence regarding this very complex issue, and if the Commissioner sees fit to make recommendations as to the nature of the studies that need to be done, do you see the value in ensuring how those studies would be done, including the participation of industry in funding those studies and getting to the bottom of this?
I would say that's for the Commissioner to decide on those recommendations.
Would that be valuable to you?
I would have to see what the studies are and what the recommendations are.
Given the strong concerns raised by First Nations inside and outside of this inquiry as to the effect of finfish farms on wild salmon and the exercise of their Section 35 rights, are you willing to rely upon annual renewals of the licenses along the Fraser River sockeye salmon migratory routes until such work, including the studies and the consultation that I've just mentioned, has been implemented?
That's a piece of work that would require more thought than just answering a question here.
So you're willing to consider?
Yes.
Are you also willing to consider adding as a term of the license the obligation to participate in the experimental removal, fallowing, or relocation of these finfish farms along the migratory route?
I don't know. I can't answer. In the absence of a full discussion, I don't know which of the parts would be acceptable or not acceptable.
But you'd be willing to consider it?
Of course.
All right. Let's move on to Sarah and the socioeconomic analysis. And Ms. Stansbury, you can relax for a bit. These questions are for Mr. Bevan. You're familiar, Mr. Bevan, with DFO's recommendations made in 2004 that the Minister of Environment not list cultus or Sakano as endangered under the SARA, correct?
Yes, I am.
And you mentioned this process in November when you first testified before the Commissioner, correct?
Yes, I believe I did.
And on November 2nd, and it's at transcript page 42 if we need to, but you testified that one of the reasons that cultus wasn't listed was, and I'm quoting now, very extensive socioeconomic implications. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Now, the Commissioner's heard a lot of evidence regarding the cultus-SARA decision, and he's heard specifically from Dr. Davies, who you know correctly?
That's correct.
And Mr. Schubert, who was the head of the cultus recovery team and is now head of the freshwater ecosystems with Science Branch in Burnaby. Are you familiar with him also?
Not personally as I am with Dr. Davis.
All right. On May 31st, transcript page 31, line 43, Dr. Davis says this: there was a round of criticism of the socioeconomic analysis coming from a lot of quarters. And then also at line 20, transcript page 32 on the same day, he said, DFO recognized in fact that we had more robust that we had to have more robust socioeconomic analysis. Mr. Schubert, head of the cultist recovery team, gave evidence here on May 31st, and at page 72, line 40, he says this: the socioeconomic report authored by Gord Gislason, and I quote now, seemed quite rudimentary and undeveloped, and I didn't realize it was a final document. Then further at page 74 of the same day, he says, the cultist sockeye recovery working group has identified 6 major issues with the socioeconomic analysis. Now, having heard those two gentlemen's comments as it relates to the socioeconomic, and reflecting on your earlier testimony, do you agree that there may have been some deficiencies in the socioeconomic analysis that DFO relied on to make its recommendations that cultists in Sakana not be listed under SARA?
We expected the socioeconomic analysis to come under tremendous scrutiny and criticism, because of the people who disagree with the decision would use that mechanism to bring it into question. So we wanted to have as much robustness around the analysis as we possibly could. I would say that while some flaws could be pointed out by critics of the analysis, what is the basic issue is the scale of the impact that listing the cultists at Sakana Lakes would have had on the economics of the fishery and other activities in British Columbia. So there was, I don't think whether it was within plus or minus $1 million is a question. Whether it is in the ballpark, I think it is. I think it provided the minister with the scale of the impacts, and that the minister had to have that information in order to come to a reasonable determination as to what the Government of Canada wished to do with the recommendation that came from COSEWIC. So I'm not going to say that it's perfect. I'm saying that it is that it provided the scale of the impacts, and we did expect that there'd be some criticism. So we tried to ensure it was as robust as possible in that. Whether it's a science report or whether it's a socioeconomic report, people who don't like decisions usually go to the criticism of the reports that support the decision, and that's what happened here.
Would you agree that DFO, First Nations, and stakeholders in British Columbia would benefit from improving our capacity to do socioeconomic analysis and be better informed about the socioeconomic implications, so that decisions like this can be done more transparently and reliably, including those decisions that are envisioned by the wild salmon policy? And perhaps as a corollary to that, do you agree that there is a unique challenge associated with establishing the and understanding the socioeconomic implications of the loss of food, social, and ceremonial fisheries to First Nations?
I'm going to ask that Ms. Gertner let the witness answer the first question before she goes to the second question, particularly because in these questions are very long, have multiple clauses within them, and to some extent have speeches within them as well, which the witnesses can speak to. But I think in fairness to the witness, Ms. Farlinger should have one question at a time.
Ms. Farlinger, I think you understood the 2 parts to the question.
With respect to the first part to the question, one thing I will say is that in DFO regionally we have rebuilt our capacity to do economic analysis, specifically within what's called our policy branch in the region, and we currently have increased the number of economists with expertise in that area. We have done that for a couple of reasons. One is for the requirement in the Integrated Fishery Management Plan for an economic view or overview of the fishery, but the other is to get at the issues you raise, which was an improvement from our previous capacity to be able to do economic analysis. I think the issue of the social components of the analysis are certainly difficult, and it's not a capacity we have in DFO, but we will often contract consultants or others to do that. So.
And you'll agree at this point in time, we've seen a number of the reports that you do have, and you'll agree that we do need to look carefully at the socioeconomic implications and how you would even measure those as it relates to First Nations access to food, social, and ceremonial fisheries.
That's certainly a challenging area, yes.
Thank you. Okay, I need to move on again, and I'm going to go to Exhibit 327, which is the 2009, which you'll recall the nature of the year of 2009 now, and it's the approval of the IFMP. Ms. Stansfield, this question's to you. And again, this is an example, and I'd like to go to page 6 of the document, PDF 6 and page 6 of the document. This is the signature of it. And this is the IFMP. It's setting out various different harvest opportunities that are being planned for the 2009 year. And you'll note the comment that's reached that the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans puts there, need to ensure we maximize opportunities for commercial fisheries. I'm curious, and my clients are very curious, as to why it doesn't say need to ensure that we need to maximize ensuring Section 35 fishing rights are properly provided the necessary priorities. Could you help us understand the nature of the comment and why it doesn't include the Section 35 fishing rights?
Excuse me, I object if my friend is inquiring as to why someone else, namely the minister, made an entry on that document. I say it is way beyond the ability of this panel to start reading into the mind of the minister.
Well, Ms. Stansfield, you and the minister approved this briefing note, or approved this fishing plan. Could you advise the nature of the concerns the minister was raising with you at the time around maximizing opportunities for commercial fisheries?
I apologize, same issue. It's hearsay evidence if the deputy minister is informing this commission as to what was in the minister's mind at the time.
With all due respect, Mr. Commissioner, if it's hearsay, you'll decide what weight you want to put it to it. This is an important issue, as I've mentioned, as to how headquarters makes decisions. I'd like Ms. Stansfield's thoughts on this.
Well, I think it's more than thoughts. I guess the most helpful thing is, does she have any personal knowledge
Sure.
regarding those words on the page?
Let's start there.
No, I don't.
Then let's turn to possible solutions to what and again, your council may feel uncomfortable with my opening comment here, but I have to say these 3 examples provide the kinds of concerns that our clients have around making sure that the decision makers in Ottawa are fully informed of the concerns and interests of First Nations. And so I'm going to move forward now to First Nations Coalition document number 2. Deputy Minister, I understand that this July, the First Nations Leadership Council, being the UBCIC, the Summit, and the AFN, and it's on the screen, Ms. Stansfield, and certain representatives of the First Nations Fisheries Council met with the Minister to talk about key issues facing First Nations in British Columbia related to fisheries and aquaculture. Is that correct?
I wasn't at the meeting. Ms. Farlinger, I think, was.
Oh, great. Sorry, at least one of you were there. That's great. Ms. Farlinger, do you recall that meeting?
I do.
And agree that during that meeting, the First Nations Leadership Council emphasized the need for a strategic level government-to-government relationship between First Nations Leadership Council and the Minister.
The First Nations leadership put forward a proposal for a system of meetings between the Minister and the First Nations Leadership Council.
And one of the suggestions was that the Minister enter into an MOU with the First Nations Leadership Council that would outline mutual commitments to work together on areas of shared interest and importance, correct?
That was part of the proposal, yes.
And do you recognize this letter, which is dated July 13, as being a letter from the First Nations Leadership Council to Minister Ashfield as a follow-up to the July 7th meeting?
I have seen this letter in our correspondence system.
And you recall at paragraph 3 of this letter, the First Nations Leadership Council is strongly recommending entering into a formal MOU, correct?
I see that's noted in the letter, yes.
Thank you. Could I have that marked as the next exhibit?
1961.
And if I could go then to First Nations Coalition's document number 3. Ms. Dansero, perhaps you recognize this letter, which is dated August 2nd, as being a follow-up from the First Nations Fisheries Council's meeting and letter to Minister Ashfield. Do you recognize this letter?
I have not seen this letter. I take it for what you say it is.
Ms. Farminger, do you recognize this letter?
I have to say I don't, although it's very likely that I've seen it in the course of my work.
And you recognize, well, paragraph 3, it speaks for itself, that the First Nations Fisheries Council, which you're familiar with and have been working with, is committed to providing the technical and operational support to the Leadership Council as part of the government-to-government relationship. And that is the type of working relationship you're developing with the First Nations Fisheries Council, correct?
The First Nations Fisheries Council, excuse me for a moment while I read this. I understand the perspective that the First Nations Fisheries Council is committed to providing that technical and operational support to the Leadership Council. The work of Fisheries and Oceans with the BC First Nations Fisheries Council is focused not only on technical and operational support, but matters that can be dealt with at the level of the council and the level of the regional management in DFO.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Could I have this marked as the next exhibit?
1962.
Now, perhaps Ms. Dansero or Ms. Farminger, and perhaps or Mr. Biven, I don't know, are you aware that the Government of Canada as well as the provincial government has entered into similar types of MOUs with the First Nations Leadership Council on issues relating to housing and health?
I'm hesitating only because I think so, and so I can't say definitively.
All right, if I could go to tabs 5, 6, and 7 of our documents, please.
Would you like those up?
Yes, please.
Together?
Yes, I think that's helpful. Would that refresh your memory, Ms. Dansero, as to the existing agreements that are presently in place on issues related to housing and health at that level?
To a certain extent, although they are with other departments.
Yes. Could I have those marked as exhibits, please?
Just on 6, can Ms. Gertner say if that's a final document? There's no evidence on its face it is.
I don't have, these would have been provided.
Excuse me, Ms. Gardner. Mr. Commissioner, Philip Isaac for Area E and the Coalition. Yesterday when I was entering documents, even the annual report of the Department of Fisheries, I was numerous objections because the document couldn't be identified. And here we are entering documents as exhibits from a different department that nobody knows what it is. And you know, it does cause us a little bit of concern, although the document I don't think is particularly relevant. But I mean, if there's one standard for us, I think there probably should be a same standard for all participants. Thank you.
I am seeking that these be marked as examples of the types of MOUs that are being entered into between the Leadership Council. I have a question on them that I'm about to ask as it relates to the implementation of fisheries, strategic fisheries matters. I'll ask that question.
I'll just leave it this way. Number 7, I can't agree to it being an exhibit. I have no idea what it is. The others, I think, are largely irrelevant. Mr. Eidsvik just spoke to that, but we'll have a question. But I can see that they are documents that are signed. So fine. Number 7, I can't see that, and I don't know anything about it. I can't agree to it.
It is my understanding that it's the final version. It has been signed. I don't have a signed version in my possession right now. I wasn't aware that this was a difficulty for Mr. Taylor. Are you aware, does DFO headquarters welcome a clearer process for strategic engagement with the First Nations Leadership Council, Ms. Dansero?
Yes, we do.
And given the benefits of resolving some outstanding business between DFO and First Nations at a strategic level, do you agree that an MOU setting out mutual objectives could be a useful step within the negotiations of both joint management and addressing the challenges associated with ensuring headquarters is operating on reliable information and making decisions that could affect fisheries in British Columbia?
I guess it depends on the MOU, and I wouldn't say by saying yes to an MOU as an approach that I would want to close the door at other approaches. So it is one of many, but it would depend on the MOU itself and the discussions that we were having. We had started consultations with National Chief Atleo and Minister Shea, and we had begun a process with her and the National Chief, and we intend to continue those discussions, and where they end up, we will see.
I understand there's no objection to document 5 and 6 going forward as exhibits.
Well, with respect, there was an objection.
Oh, sorry.
Mr. Eidsvik took the position that there ought not to be two standards, and
with due respect, I don't think we're dealing with two different standards here. These are documents that are relevant to my client, who's a party to this matter, and their relationship with the Government of Canada.
Yeah, Mr. Taylor also raised the issue of relevance, although I don't know he's particularly pressing that submission, but there are objections.
If I objected on relevance, there would be an awful lot of objections.
Exactly.
So I don't tend to do that.
Yeah,
I've
neither do
raised
I.
it, and I've raised a point about number 7. Mr. Eidsvik's got his further points.
Mr. Commissioner, just pointing out, yesterday I was trying to get a document in the 1925-26 annual report of the Department of Fisheries, and there was objections to it because nobody could identify it. And of course, nobody in this room is alive to identify that that was the proper document. And now I see documents coming in, but I'll withdraw my objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Eidsvik. Again, we'll go back to the tabs here. I'm sorry, Ms. Gardner, you've got tabs 5, 6, and 7, is that
That's correct, and I understand that she's still objecting.
Yes, 5 and 6 will be marked, 7 will be marked for identification purposes only.
All right.
Document number 5 will be 1963. Document number 6 will be 1964. Document number 7 will be marked as NNN, triple N.
Do you welcome the continued discussions with the Leadership Council in completing an MOU that might be useful to both them and the Government of Canada through the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Ms. Dansero?
I certainly welcome continued discussion. Whether or not it ends in an MOU, I don't know.
Ms. Farlinger, would that be helpful at the regional level?
I think the First Nations Fisheries Council, which is largely a regional First Nations council to advise on regional matters, is certainly very useful to me in terms of the implementation of operational programs in BC and any regional advice that we provide to policy processes. So that perspective that's provided by the council, and the council has been very careful to say that they do not represent individual First Nations. So I just want to be clear that the nature of that relationship is clearly focused on higher level regional type issues rather than issues specific to any particular First Nation. Is certainly helpful to us, and anything that supports that would very likely be helpful depending on what it was.
Thank you. With the limited time I have left, which is approximately 15 minutes, I'm going to turn to one more topic, which is perhaps bearing down on what we've just talked about, which is how to implement co-management and consultative processes in a complex environment such as the Fraser River. Now, Ms. Farlinger, you're familiar with Barry Huber's work, I'm assuming, and Ms. Dansero, Mr. Bevan, are you also familiar with Barry Huber's work? He's been with the Department of Fisheries for over 30 years. He's been a resource manager and an Aboriginal Affairs advisor, and he's now on special assignment to build a co-management structure with First Nations on the Fraser watershed. Are you familiar with his work?
No, not specifically.
I'm familiar with Barry, but not with this most recent work, no.
All right, but Ms. Farlinger, you're aware of the work that he's doing through the roadmap process and otherwise to try to implement a co-management structure on the Fraser watershed?
Yes, to try to design and in fact ultimately, yes, put an arrangement into place.
Now, Mr. Huber has come to give evidence, and so the commissioners had the benefit of his thoughts and ideas on the roadmap and developing a Tier 1, 2 process, so I'm not going to go through all of that. I think it's useful for the commissioner to hear from you, Ms. Farlinger, about some of the challenges, and from you, Ms. Dansero, where it's appropriate. But I'm going to use one of his documents, and I need to go to Heiltsuk Tribal Council's document number 75, which is a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, a SWOT assessment that Mr. Huber did in 2008. I appreciate that it is a bit dated, but I think some of the key topics are useful. Now, Ms. Farlinger, do you recognize this as a Department of Fisheries and Oceans document, and have you seen it before?
I have been briefed on this document, but I don't believe I've specifically seen it.
All right. Could I have this marked as an exhibit?
1965.
And I'd like to turn to page 9. It won't surprise you. It's a topic. It's under the heading Options and Ideas for Change. And section B particularly, does DFO have other options for achieving stability of the resource and reconciliation with First Nations other than treaty? And under this heading I find these words. DFO needs to work through a mutually agreeable process with representatives of Aboriginal organizations, whether in treaty processes or not, to build a management structure such as the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, bracket, example, a Fraser River Fisheries Commission, end of bracket. Initially, this will require an engagement strategy with DFO, followed by our Aboriginal organizations and non-government organizations that support activities associated with the management of fisheries and protection of fish and fish habitat. So I'll stop there for a moment. My question for you, first of all, Ms. Farlinger, is do you agree with Mr. Huber that building a structure like the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission with First Nations is a good way to achieve stability of the resource and reconciliation with First Nations?
I think that the specificity of the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, which of course exists in an entirely different governance structure, is probably a bit strong. I think that as part of this process, I recall that DFO and First Nations had invited the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission to come and advise the group on the nature of the commission and their work. I think that what we are attempting to build through, I'm going to call it informally the forum or the roadmap process, it is something that is more closely tailored to our situation here in BC. But there are certainly aspects of the organization and the challenge and things we can learn from the challenges faced and resolved in the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission.
Ms. Dansborough, can you confirm that DFO headquarters has also concluded that achieving collaborative governance with First Nations inside and outside of treaty will be a good way to achieve stability of the resource and reconciliation with First Nations?
I would say that we certainly agree that collaboration is required through in all of our relationships.
But specifically with First Nations is my question.
That it would be helpful, yes.
And can you also confirm that DFO headquarters hopes or intends to proceed to do such work and reach such agreements without the necessity of conducting strength of claim analysis for every First Nation along the migratory route of the Fraser River sockeye salmon?
I can't answer that question.
Ms. Farlinger, can you answer that question?
As to the specific processes for arriving at a collaborative structure, I can't comment on whether we would use or not use strength of analysis, strength of claims analysis. It is certainly part of the tools provided to us by Department of Justice with respect to how we deal with many matters about Aboriginal fishing, and we certainly do use it and would use it in some circumstances. I think the process of building a collaborative structure may or may not include that, but I certainly don't see it as a universal application.
All right, I need to move on because I'm very time sensitive here. Mr. Huber also suggested at the bottom of page 9 that where appropriate, support for intertribal treaties and the looking for opportunities for supporting organizations to resolve difficult issues such as overlapping claims and fish allocation issues. And I'll stop here again. Do you see the benefit of developing capacity within First Nations organizations to facilitate dialogue amongst themselves as it relates to intertribal allocations and to reach necessary agreements at that level? Ms. Farlinger?
I think that processes for First Nations to resolve these issues are very important, yes.
And I have to move on quickly, so I can't do the lead that I'd hoped to do with you as it relates to the next two questions, but I'll get down to the basic, which is, do you see the resolution of the allocation issues and the resolution of providing a meaningful place for First Nations as managers as useful incentives for bringing in First Nations leadership into the discussions in a meaningful way. And I'll start again with Ms. Farlinger, given her experiences in this matter in BC. So resolution of allocation and resolution of co-management as useful incentives for increasing active participation by First Nations leadership in these issues.
It seems a very general question, and I think both those aspects are important understandings that we need to have with First Nations leadership to move forward on improved fisheries management.
But allocation and co-management are important incentives to that leadership involvement. You've heard that over and over again over the years.
But they're important aspects to having better fisheries management and better relationships with First Nations leadership.
Thank you. And the 5, could I have that marked as the next exhibit?
1966.
I understand from many around me that I have 5 minutes left. I have to go to one final matter, which is pick fee and terminal fisheries. I want to turn to Exhibit 1746, which is our tab 14, which is DFO's evaluation of pick fee dated August 31st, 2010. And in particular at pages 8 and 9, there's a recommendation number 3. If you could just take a moment and read that. Pick fee should lead a move toward a terminal fishery for salmon, offering more support for this transition through all elements of the initiative. Decisions on a balance between ocean and in-river allocation should be made in consultation with First Nations. The transition should be coordinated with license acquisitions so that appropriate species are available to mitigate any potential loss to First Nations that might otherwise have received increased allocations to fish for salmon in the ocean. And then recommendation number 7, DFO should plan for the continuation of pick fee activities after the 5-year program ends, contingent on available resources. Ms. Dansborough and Ms. Farlinger, do you agree with these recommendations? And let's start with that.
I should say that this is a midterm report that was done by the internal DFO evaluation directorate and was required by the government, by the Treasury Board, as part of the pick fee program. I should say that the recommendations included in this report were generally useful. The process to arrive at these recommendations was not necessarily an internal analysis, and that internal analysis, as the Deputy has indicated earlier, is still ongoing with respect to the aspects of pick fee, which of those should be carried forward and which of those may not, and how that may or may not be funded or brought into the fishery management. So specifically on recommendation number 3, no decision has yet been made, and on recommendation number 7, which I believe is about the continuation of pick fee, is still under evaluation.
So at this point, you can't say whether you agree with those recommendations?
That's right.
And Ms. Dansborough, are you in the same position?
Yes.
Are you aware of the call from First Nations for the continuation of the pick fee program for a second 5-year term?
Yes, I am.
And could I have Exhibit 1747, which is First Nations tab 13? This is the First Nations Fisheries Council's report that puts together a business case for the second phase of pick fee from 2012 to 2017. Ms. Farlinger, have you had an opportunity to review this report?
I have seen this report, yes.
And do you agree that some of the lasting benefits of pick fee that First Nations have identified, and I'll take you to page 12, are reduced conflicts, savings to Canada, improved fisheries management, enhanced regional economies, and social benefits to First Nations?
I do agree that those are benefits of pick fee, yes.
And would you agree that the pick fee program recognizes that terminal fishery programs may not be immediately profitable, but that the aim is that they would become sustainable over time?
I think that the pick fee terminal fisheries or in-river fisheries are still under evaluation as pilots, and so obviously the economic viability of those is something that we would continue to want to understand.
and continue to work on. And in some ways, it's an example of how the initiatives in PICFI are what I would call half-baked. We're not quite finished the work that we've started under PICFI.
Testing things sometimes takes longer than we thought.
So you agree with me?
I agree with you that sometimes we don't have a conclusion on the in-river fisheries at this point.
Yeah, there's more work to be done. I just have one final question. Would you agree that the road to co-management through the roadmap and the forum and all the outgoing work and the efforts under the wild salmon policy are really a process of DFO incrementally sharing responsibility with First Nations and finding a place at the table for them in the ongoing management of the fisheries?
I think that the evolution of the co-management process is happening on a continuum which largely has to do with everyone bringing their authorities to the table, that is DFO and the First Nations, and figuring out what the interaction is between those authorities and sharing information and therefore knowledge and in that process. The extent, the endpoint, I can't identify.
But incrementally sharing responsibility in a clear and more cooperative manner is the goals of those processes.
I think that it may include the sharing of responsibilities on both sides, and that may be simply through increased understanding or maybe through a more explicit arrangement. So I think that we're not at the point of deciding what is shared and what is not shared at this point.
Apparently I have to sit down, so Mr. Commissioner, I am completed my questions, and thank you very much, panel.
Thank you, Ms. Gardner.
Mr. Commissioner, it's Tim Dixon for the Stalo Tribal Council. Good morning, afternoon, panel. I want to start by asking a little bit about traditional Aboriginal knowledge. We've heard a number of times in this inquiry that First Nations have a great deal to offer in terms of fisheries management, including through the incorporation of traditional Aboriginal knowledge. And recently, David Marmarek, I think, encapsulated the benefits of it well. He stated that TEK is a very important form of knowledge, in particular because of the time span, both in duration and also in terms of resolution. Namely, that people, First Nations, have been in particular locations for a very long period of time, have seen many fluctuations in resources, have amazing memories about, they said, well, hopefully recorded from elders and the like about what's changed, but also because they're there all the time during a given year. Ms. Farlinger, do you agree that traditional Aboriginal knowledge is a unique source of knowledge and that it's different than the local knowledge that many experienced fishers have?
I do.
And Dr. Richards, do you agree?
Yes, I do.
Well, Ms. Farlinger, in your evidence on this panel, I believe I heard you express support for the incorporation of TEK into the management of Fraser Sockeye. Is that right?
That's certainly an objective we have in the implementation of our programs, yes.
And it's an objective because much more can be done to incorporate TEK into fisheries management. That's fair?
I think that's fair. The incorporation of traditional ecological knowledge has been a challenging area, certainly in terms of mutual understandings of how information is recorded and communicated, and concerns that First Nations themselves have about the use of the knowledge. So while it's certainly an objective, and we're very interested in that knowledge because of the contribution we think it can make to the management of Fraser Sockeye in this instance, we are continuing and moving slowly, I would say, on the incorporation because of those and some other issues.
Yes, and I want to put the proposition to you that perhaps the best way of addressing the challenges in the incorporation of TEK is to incorporate Aboriginal organizations into fisheries management. Would you accept that that is a direction that could yield benefits for incorporating TEK?
Certainly, one of the objectives of the various Aboriginal programs that we have as they're implemented in the region, which is to build capacity for Aboriginal organizations, and as you know, there are a variety of them out there, including the recently come together Lower Fraser Fishing Authority. I may have the name wrong, and all of these things are focused on improved management of the fishery, and the extent to which we can bring in traditional Aboriginal knowledge to those processes will help us improve fisheries management.
I want now to turn to Aboriginal rights just very quickly. I don't want to ask you about the Aboriginal rights of any particular First Nation, but rather more generally. Ms. Farlinger, you accept, don't you, that a number of First Nations have Aboriginal rights to Fraser Sockeye for FSC purposes?
I'm objecting to that question. Perhaps my friend might specify some communities that have proved Aboriginal rights in courts of law, rather than put the question the way he has.
I'll only add to that the way the question is framed certainly sounds like it's calling for a legal conclusion. Even if the witness, Ms. Farlinger, answers in terms of how it's applied or how they apply the requests and so forth that they get from First Nations, it might be taken as some kind of legal conclusion or legal admission or whatever. This is really about what factually is done, how is the fisheries managed and so forth. So I do have some concerns about framing the question in terms of what rights are there. She's not here to speak on legal rights.
Yes, Mr. Lowes, before you cut in,
Well, I think I can help you here. I'm with Mr. Taylor on that one, that if perhaps I suggest that Mr. Dixon might ask what working assumptions about rights are held or applied.
Well, I'm not sure I'm with Mr. Lowes on that. I don't know how much that helps.
Ms. Farlinger, DFO has a policy of allowing First Nations to fish for FSC purposes, some of those First Nations on Fraser River Sockeye. That's fair enough?
Yes, the department provides for access for food, social, and ceremonial fisheries for the practical purposes of fisheries management, consistent with our understanding of potential and existing First Nations rights.
And the department sees First Nations in that respect as being in a different category than stakeholders such as commercial and recreational fishers.
There are specific court decisions and therefore policies inside DFO that are specific to First Nations.
Well, First Nations, from the department's perspective, have a unique relationship with Fraser River Sockeye.
I'm trying hard to understand this without going outside my area of expertise. We certainly have policies that are unique to First Nations as we approach the management of fisheries that has to do with, as I said earlier, the understanding of potential and existing rights, fishing rights, yes.
Mr. Commissioner, I see the time. I'm in your hands. I can continue, or?
No, debates like we've just had make me hungry, Mr.
Exactly. I bet we should fortify ourselves. Yes.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.